Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
Sian Prior, author of two memoirs, Shy, a memoir, and Childless, a story of freedom and longing.
and I can see Shy depicted on the wall behind you. So,
Yes,
which came first, Shy or Childless, as it were?
Shy came first.
Mm.
Shy came out 8 years before Childless,
Mm.
and it took me 8 years to figure out what I wanted to say and to squeeze it out in tiny increments and do the emotional processing
Mm.
that the writing and the time took um, to work out what I wanted to say about my state of childlessness.
And I hope we'll get onto that in greater detail soon. First, I wanted to ask my banal opening gambit to people, which is to ask what's currently preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting, impeding you. What's going on at the moment for you?
Yeah, good question, Toby. Look, as with probably most of us, a huge amount of my brain and emotional spectrum is potentially very preoccupied with all the horrors going on in the world at the moment. So I am consciously trying to redirect my brain a lot of the time to more pleasurable things. And for me, that has always involved music. So I sing. At the moment, I sing in three different choral groups. And reading fiction is one of my greatest pleasures, which is weird as a non-fiction writer. And I have a little camper van, and so I try to regularly escape the city that I live in and head for one of the coasts or, head interstate to spend time by the sea, camping in my little camper van. And those are the ways that I'm managing the underlying intense distress about the state of the world.
Could you tell us a bit about the music? Because that's obviously an important part of your life now, but it has been historically as well, hasn't it? Different kinds
Yes.
of music, different forms of performance.
Yeah. So look, I was very lucky to be born into a very musical family. My parents, my grandparents, everyone played music, and I was given music lessons as a child, piano and clarinet, and I played clarinet for a very long time. And those instruments were chosen for me by my mother, but then as an adult, I chose singing as my own preferred instrument.
Mhm.
And I went off and had really thousands of dollars worth of singing lessons over the years and sang in choirs, sang in small groups, went and did an opera course at the Victorian College of the Arts here in Melbourne, where I live, which was a 3-year part-time course, really three of the most fun years of my life. And did a little bit of professional work, but mostly it's just been a really, really fun hobby for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I sing in a classical style and I sing in a French choir and I sing in a 10 voice choir and I sing in a quartet and uh, it just gives me intense pleasure. I cannot imagine my life without doing music. And of course, actually, during COVID, I did have to stop doing music with other people because endless lockdowns in my town, and that was a form of torture for me, really.
Did you guys not try to do it on Zoom or whatever
The
collectively?
delay made it impossible.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to sing with groups of people with weird audio delays is not a pleasant experience. So no, that
Now,
did
what
not
about
work.
the shower? Do you sing in the shower even though it's not
I warm up in the shower. Yeah, I do
warm
my
up in the
vocal warm
shower?
up in the
Okay,
shower. Yes,
wonderful.
yes.
So, in addition to the music, you've been a radio producer and a writer that you've already mentioned, and a teacher of writing. I think that's
Yes.
part of what you do. Maybe we could talk about those things before we get on to the books. You're a very, very remarkable journalist. I mean, I've read many of your brilliant columns. You published a number of them in this sort of dual Melbourne Sydney newspaper, Age Sydney Morning Herald, right? Which is sort of is I think a pretty good newspaper, though I don't manage to read it because it's shut. But your website gives us access to it, and I'll give people links to the website. And that journalism's really quite extraordinary. It's very personal, but it's also based on things beyond your own stories. It's got a blend of those things. I wondered if maybe you could chat a bit about that.
Yes. Well, so I began my journalism career as a current affairs producer in radio, community radio, and then the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And I spent a decade doing radio, producing and presenting. And in the end, I specialised in arts and popular culture, which is probably where I first heard your name, Toby. Using a cultural studies lens to examine popular culture on the radio. And then I left the ABC at the turn of the century and became a freelance print journalist. And I was really, really lucky at the beginning of that part of my career in that I was given a weekly personal column by the Age newspaper in
Oh,
Melbourne.
okay, right.
Yeah, so
You
hence
say luck, but that's pressure, isn't it?
crazy pressure. I
Yeah.
did that for 3 years, and finding something vaguely interesting to say about myself and or the world weekly for 3 years was no easy task. And in the end, I ran out of juice. By the end, I think I was writing rubbish, really. But then a few years later, I was offered a monthly column in The Age, and that was a much better situation for actually having something to say. And it was a much shorter. It's only 400 words, that monthly column. And at first, I was like, what on earth can I possibly say in 400 words? But it was a fabulous discipline for me to try and say something meaningful or emotionally immersive with so few words. And yeah, so I did that for about another 3 or 4 years until that came to an end during COVID, as many, many things did. And in the meantime, around 2005, I started teaching journalism and nonfiction in a really wonderful professional writing and editing course here in Melbourne at RMIT University. And I did that as a sessional casual teacher for 20 years, which I've only just ended that relationship with that university. And again, fantastic experience. I sort of found a new vocation really as a teacher of creative writing. So I would say I've just been super lucky in my career trajectories. People have offered me many, many opportunities, which I've made myself accept in the main, and and had a really fun time as a worker.
That's an amazing trajectory. Maybe I could pick on the radio bit for the moment.
Hmm.
That's a lot of pressure too. If you're producing and or presenting a regular show, it's not quite singing in the shower. Um, it's at a certain hour on a certain day, things have to happen. Content has to occur. What was that like looking back on it? Did you enjoy the stimulus of it, or were you sometimes thinking, oh God, what happens now?
Both. It was terrifying. It was adrenaline inducing. It was challenging. It was intellectually incredibly stimulating. I got to meet so many people on air who've done incredible things, particularly people working in the arts.
Mhm.
And so I loved it for those reasons, but at the same time, eventually analysed in my first memoir. It was also, it ran completely counter to my innate temperament, which was a shy one. And so, I kind of spent a decade living in terror, really. And maybe I became an adrenaline junkie because there must have been a payoff for the fear that I felt. But uh, it did, it's had an impact on my nervous system, on my digestive system. Um, and I am more and more now trying to avoid those um, public performance situations where, yeah, as I say, goes counter. My entire nervous system protests the whole time.
There's something gendered in some of this, isn't there? Because you have spoken about some of the different ways in which being shy versus being reserved can be discussed. Could you talk a bit about that and whether gender has an important aspect in your shyness, for example, do you think?
Um, it's very interesting. I think mostly it's in the language. And yeah, in the memoir, I write about how men who are shy are probably more likely to be described as reserved or, quiet. Um, Whereas women who are shy are probably more likely to be identified as shy. I don't think there are really any significant gender differences when it comes to that particular temperament trait, or that's what I've been told by the experts. So it is in the cultural interpretation of the external behaviours. And I think some part of my brain has always been very conscious of that. And it was hard enough being a woman and all the kind of crazy assumptions of weakness that have forever and ever gone along with being female. But
Mm.
to add to that, any perception of being, shy and retiring or in some way weak or afraid, I think I've always been absolutely determined not to add that burden to the pre-existing burden of just being female. And, I think that's one of the many reasons why I pushed myself way out of my comfort zones for so many years,
Mm.
because I was not going to let this thing get the better of me. And I was not going to let the world judge me in their preconceived ways for my anxious behavior.
But there is a critical moment that sort of animates you to see that you are, in inverted commas, a shy person and you're experiencing shyness, and then to write the book. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So look, I had feels melodramatic to call it a panic attack, but it was like, a mild version of a panic attack at a party when I was in my mid 40s, so 15 years ago now. I didn't know anyone. I was there with my partner, but he'd sort of disappeared. And as always, in a crowd of strangers, I felt anxious and it just sort of escalated until I literally had to flee the building and go home alone. And, and this is the time that I'm still having this very interesting and performative career. So, in some ways, it made absolutely no sense that I'm just at someone's birthday party and I'm panicking. And the next day, I might be able to go and, give a talk to thousands of people or whatever.
Mm.
So I got home and I'm like, what the hell just happened? Why can I be, have the rug pulled out from under me, still in my middle age, by this thing that I knew as shyness
Mm.
slash social anxiety? So I wrote a little, like about an 800-word piece just describing that night. And then I decided to write an essay about it, 3 or 4 thousand word essay about it, which was published. And then I thought, you know what, I still haven't got to the bottom of this. I still have a lot of questions about this thing that happens to me. And how it possibly can fit with the external version of me, which is so performative and appears so confident. So yeah, I decided to write a book about it and try and answer all those questions that I had.
Could you very roughly take us through the book?
Hmm. So, I mean, the book starts with me listing all my questions about shyness in the wake of this party flight experience. And they were things like, what is shyness? Is it the same as introversion? Why am I shy? What do the experts say about it? Are there any benefits to being shy? Is it possible to cure yourself of shyness? And probably most important of all, why am I so concerned about this still? And why am I still being wrong-footed by it at this age? So I just did that thing that most memoirists do, which is I just started, I sent my mind on a search mission to remember all the really vivid moments of shyness or social anxiety, and at the same time start talking to, interviewing, reading the experts, psychologists, sociologists, linguists, you know, theorists, like cultural theorists, to find out what they had found out about shyness/social anxiety, and put that information that I was gathering together with my memories to try and illuminate what the hell had been going on. Um, and, I think I did. Some part of my brain really hoped if I just could find out enough about it, I could cure myself.
Mm.
And one of the most important pieces of information I discovered via psychologists was, at its heart, shyness or social anxiety is a fear of negative evaluation or a fear of rejection, essentially. And then by some hideous narrative gift, in the middle of doing this research and writing about it, I was rejected by my partner of 10 years. Suddenly, completely out of the blue, shockingly. And I was instantly immersed in the very fear that I really had spent my whole life trying to avoid, and the
And this
fear
was
I had
presumably
betrayed a lot.
the same person who had disappeared at the party.
Well, hello. Yes,
It's
there
very,
were signs I can now see.
I, I guess symbolically it fits together, though of course it's coincidental, but it makes a neat narrative thread. Gosh, so suddenly your fear of abandonment was justified. Is that fair to
Yeah.
say? Yeah.
Oh God, absolutely. And it's interesting, Toby, because when I first finished the memo and presented it to a literary agent, she said, "Look, yeah, it's an interesting book, but you've written two books here. You've written a book about shyness and you've written a book about a relationship coming to an end." And so then I had to go back and just make sure that I'd sort of sown the seed so that the reader knew the stakes for me of this relationship coming to an end, that this was my greatest fear. I mean, someone once said, if you're going to make a movie about someone who's afraid of the dark, the lights better go out. And that's kind of what happened to me. Was I was writing a book about rejection and I got rejected. The lights went out.
If you feel shy and you're worried about rejection, you're right to be, because it's going to happen. Look out, folks.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
anyway, yeah. So yes, the book sort of changes in the last third, and it becomes this sort of breathless, gasping, account of trying to kind of stay afloat, really, in the midst of what was acute anxiety. Like I literally scarcely slept for several years and swam 30 laps every morning, 30 laps of a 50-meter pool every morning just to manage my nervous system. Um, and, eventually kind of got my act together, but yeah, that's Shy, a
Where
memoir.
does trust come into this?
Trust about what? What do you mean?
Well, presumably, if one's afraid of rejection, that
Hmm.
relates in some way to having trust in what you're perceiving, in what's being offered to you, what's being promised,
Hmm.
what's happening.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that in general, if you so the other thing I discovered is that shyness is part of a temperament trait. You know, we're all born with a bunch of temperament traits,
Hmm.
and one of them is what's called the approach withdrawal spectrum. And you see it in babies and toddlers. You know, if it's a shy baby or toddler on the withdrawal end of that spectrum, you know, if it's in its mother's arms and you, a stranger, approach it, it will lurch away and, you know, hide in its mother's or father's neck. If it's a child that's born on the approach end of the spectrum, it will probably lean out and, you know, offer to hug you. So that was really useful information for me. This stuff is hardwired, and I had two shy parents. So, you know, I was kind of stuffed from the beginning, really. Um, I know what was your question. Of course, I've just
It was about
launched into.
trust,
Oh,
how this
trust. That's
relates
right. Okay.
to generating
Yeah.
trust or losing trust or
Yeah. Yeah.
doubting
So,
trust.
so yeah, good question. So, um, think that if you are shy, if you're born on the, you know, withdrawal end of the temperance spectrum, it is hard to trust the world because you are pump primed to be cautious and worry about all the what ifs. What if this terrible thing happens? What if that terrible thing happens? And, you know, from an evolutionary basis, it makes sense that we need a mix of approach and withdrawal people. We need the cautious people to kind of go, you know, I wouldn't leave the cave this morning. I heard a lion growling. And then you have the people who go, well, we need the food. I'm just going to brave the lion, you know.
Mm.
Um, but of course, then there's the then of course we bring our it's nature and nurture. We bring our own life experiences to this. And the other thing that I write about in the memoir is the fact that when I was 3 months old, my family had a trip to the beach with members of the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, which my father, a trumpet player, was playing with. And a few people got into strife in the surf, and my big brave father went out to try and rescue them and drowned in front of my mother and her three young children. And I was only 3 months old. So for many, many years, I told myself, oh, I was the lucky one. I didn't know anything about it. But that story is a very, very powerful story. And, you know, my childhood was imbued with that story. I look like my father. And at some level, I think an experience like that or a story of experience like that would impact your view of the world. What if, you know, here's the what ifs. What if you go to the beach and your father drowns? You know, terrible things can suddenly happen.
Mm.
So, by both nurture and nature, I was primed to fear the advent of terrible things. And then one, you know, happened to
And
me.
then what happened to you? And the book comes out. I've read several reviews of it, very well received. I think quite admiring reviews, at least the ones that I read. And presumably, there are also some interviews that you do with the media. I imagine some of those were awkward, given that they're about shyness, and perhaps some of the interviewers didn't quite know how to ask you about it.
Well, that's very interesting, Toby. And this brings me to the other sort of main theme of the book, because in fact, I really enjoyed that process of selling the book. I enjoyed being able to, I mean, I just spent 4 or 5 years immersed in all of this stuff, and I was preaching. I wanted to tell the world what I had learned about shyness and social anxiety. And I was in professional Shan mode. So that's the other thing I explore in the book is that It's like there are two versions of me. Professional Shine is the person you are speaking to today. And I probably sound, perfectly relaxed and like I know what I'm talking about. Uh, and it's like a sort of a persona that I've found a way to adopt to hide the other version, which is this super shy, super anxious person. And what I discovered was that if I was in professional mode, in other words, I was somehow representing a cause or an institution much, much larger than me,
Hmm.
then I could sort of set aside all my personal anxieties about negative evaluation and rejection because it wasn't me that was being evaluated, it was the cause or, the field or the topic. So I was perfectly fine doing that publicity. But things were very different with the second book, actually.
Let's get on to that. It's also a very personal, very, very powerful volume. Could you tell us a bit about its prehistory or genesis and what the book?
Yeah. So I think for a long time I've thought I've got two stories to tell about my life. One is the Shyness story, and one is the long and complicated and very difficult history of my attempts to become a mother.
Mm.
And, I had always wanted to have children, and I started trying to have children in my early 30s, and it didn't happen. And I had multiple miscarriages and long periods of apparent infertility, and it sort of caused the collapse of the relationship I was in that decade. Um, and then I tried all sorts of other ways, and it did not happen.
Mhm.
And that was, in retrospect, a source of immense grief to me. But at the time that it was happening, I did not allow myself to feel or process that grief. I was just like, right, keep going, carry on, try again. Uh, and and then, once I had to conclude it wasn't going to happen, I then, again was like, right, well, I'm just going to enjoy what I can. Um, and what I could enjoy at the time was that next relationship. And of course, that's the one that then I was ejected from. And so that was the moment of reckoning for me. It was like, okay, so I can't have the kids I wanted. I've lost the step kids and, step family that I had entered into. It's just me now. What the hell? Who am I? What am I going to do with the rest of my life?
Mm.
What are my attachments? Um, and how can I mm, try and turn what feels like an absolute negative in my life into something positive? So when I turned 50, I bought a little van and I converted it into a camper van, and I started embracing this crazy freedom that my losses had led to, and traveling around the country in the van, and finally processing my deep sadness about that, you know, um, loss of a version of my life that I always assumed I was going to have. So that's the narrative of Childless. It's telling the story of why I wanted to have kids, how I tried to have kids, how that did not happen, how I processed the grief, what I tried to do to turn that negative into a positive.
And is there a third volume?
Good question. At the end of writing Childless, I said to myself, never again. No more memoirs. I'm done. And 3 years later, I'm starting to noodle around with something vaguely memoiristic about events that took place in the last 7 or 8 years. It's always a 7 or 8 year thing for me. So, and it's very, very early days. I don't really know what I'm doing yet. But again, it's about, for me, I write about emotional challenges that have preoccupied me. That's my shtick, I guess. So
Sure.
we'll see. I may or may not complete it. Yeah.
Understood. I mean, I guess the thing I found when I was going through the columns of yours, various other things that are so generously, as I mentioned, reproduced on your website, was that although there was a lot of sharing of yourself, you always seem to be able to ride the boundary between self-disclosure and issues that this might touch on that are broader than you. I think that's a real skill in your writing, that there's a lot that's shan, whether it's professional or shy shan, but there's always, and perhaps it's partly to do with your sociological, psychological orientation that you mentioned, to go beyond yourself and see what this might mean for others or might mean for society more generally. Is that something you focus on, or is that something I'm reading in and imagining?
No, that's absolutely something that drives me, and it's something that I teach my students and the writers that I mentor. Because of course, the greatest fear for a memoirist or personal columnist is the question, why should anyone care about me? It's a very important question, and so I always encourage myself and my students to ask ourselves that question.
Mm.
And in essence, it's about trying to figure out the universal elements of whatever the personal experience is that you are exploring. So, if I think about Shy and memoir, yes, it's about shyness. Yes, it's about me. Who cares? But if you step back and you say, no, it's about fear and it's about shame and it's about fear of shame, and it's about wanting to be something or someone you were never going to be, and it's about coming to terms with never becoming the person you thought you were going to be. And you could say exactly the same about my second memoir, you know, that's my same story I keep telling. Um, and so people who aren't shy won't necessarily relate to the shyness part of it, but they'll relate to the fear part of it, and they'll relate perhaps to the rejection part of it. So yeah, and it's also about, it's a great way to avoid the trap of self-pity, which is something that I tried to write about in my PhD. I did a PhD in creative writing, a creative practice PhD, where I thought and wrote about the process of writing Shy. And one of the chapters addresses this idea of the question of self-pity and how vital it is that you do not dump your reader in a stinking pond of self-pity, that you actually have to find ways to be self-compassionate, but not self-indulgent when you're writing about yourself. So that, attaching your personal story to a bigger issue or idea or cause is a great way to do that too.
I have a recollection, which may be accurate or not, of David Malouf, the notable Australian poet and novelist and librettist, I guess, too, right? Saying that all first novels are autobiographical, and that often that means you actually, having written them, which was necessary, need to toss them away. And I think I'm right in saying that his first novel is Jono, which is remarkable, I think. And the way that I understand him to speak about that kind of writing is that there may be elements of the personal threading all the way through, but they're not dominant, animating forces. Now, I may be attributing things to him he never said, who knows? But in my fantasy, that's what he's on about. I wondered about some of the things related to that and what you said earlier, that you have taught your students over the years, whether at RMIT University or in the classes that I think you run now as a mentor, as a guide, and so on,
Hmm.
dealing with this question of the personal and whether it might weave in and out of non-fiction, which is what you're focused on, I know, as opposed to the fictional, which is the Maloof sphere.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, my genre is creative nonfiction,
Mm.
which is just a wonderful mode of writing, which enables me to both use my journalistic craft of, finding out the facts, doing the research, presenting the information, but also being a bit more playful and creative. And so creative nonfiction borrows a lot of the strategies of fiction writing. Um, and, so there are parts of Shy, for example, which are entirely made up. I describe a scene in which a shy Albert Einstein goes to accept his Nobel Prize and is trying to write down a list of possible conversation topics to discuss at the after show party in case he has to talk to strangers because he was famously shy. And it's playful and the reader knows that it's made up, but this is the glorious freedom of the creative part of creative nonfiction, is that you can make stuff up. So long as the reader knows it's that that they know that it's made up. I mean, I read fiction by preference. I love novels, and I started out many, many years ago trying to write a novel with a shy main character, which of course was a very loosely disguised version of moi. And to be honest, Toby, it was terrible. It was a terrible book. It was terrible writing. It was strained and fake and self-conscious. And fortunately, I realized that and abandoned it and just concluded that I just actually need to tell my story because that's going to be a lot more honest and freeing and potentially relatable for other people. And, I write in Shy about the notion or the question in my mind, which was, is this a memoir or is this a self-help book? And of course, it ended up being both for me and ideally for shy readers. Yeah.
And I've got one more question, if I may, and then after that, I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak about either or both things we've already mentioned, but where you'd like to add something, or maybe even subtract, or any domains that you want to touch on that we haven't mentioned. Does that sound okay?
Mm,
Way of
great.
closing things out. So my last question gets back to this issue of gender. Obviously, there are particularly gendered elements to Childless in terms of the procedures that you went through, for example, and the experiences. I'm interested in whether both books have attracted or drawn or dynamized distinctly gendered responses. Whether here comes one of the cats that I alerted you to earlier, but actually, after scratching me very gently and biting my fingers a few minutes ago, she's descended to the floor, which I think is good for all concerned. So she didn't draw blood, so I'm a bit disappointed. I was hoping that I could pick up the laptop and say, just a moment, Doc Shan, and race off to the bathroom to get some water on
Find
the
a band-aid.
Satan wound. But are there distinctly gendered reactions you've had to either or both books to your work in general? In your classes, do they tend to be more women than men, which is my guess, related to that?
Yeah. So that's two. Let me address both of two
Mm.
different questions there.
Yeah.
One is the responses to the books. No, I would say not. Mm, Shy, I received about 100 emails from readers in the first couple of years after that came out. Probably an equal number of male and female correspondents wanting to share their experiences of shyness with me. And I was deeply moved by that, by
Mm.
you know, the stories of suffering basically that people shared with me. And that makes sense because temperament traits, I think, are pretty evenly distributed amongst the genders. And with Childless, I have to say there was not a lot of feedback on that book. Um, and I think that's in part because the grief of childlessness is such a private thing that people didn't even feel moved to write to me, even though I had been through it myself. Um, so there, and therefore no perceivable gendered response there. In relation to your question about people who come to my classes, I mean, I run short online courses in creative nonfiction and writing for well-being, kind of writing as therapy because writing's been so therapeutic for me. And yes, by and large, it's women. Normally, it's maybe 10 women to 2 men at most. And, you know, I don't know exactly why that is. I could put forward theories. I think, you know, women are more inclined to share stories about themselves in general with their friends, with their families. You know, I think there's more freedom for women to tell personal emotional stories. I think women are not afraid to ask advice of another woman, whereas I've had some male students who clearly find it very discomforting that I'm the person in authority in this teaching situation, and they are quite keen to tell me what they know. Um, so, you know, yes, those things are inevitably gender inflected. But, you know, I mean, I really hope more and more men will be interested in exploring their lives in these forms, in these memoiristic or therapeutic forms, because,
Well,
you
women
know, it's a
read
lot of
books
benefits.
much more than men in most of the societies where there are data on this. Women
So,
read.
sorry, say that again, Toby. I missed the question.
Well, it's a comment really that women read more books than men do in
Yes,
most of the societies where
yes,
we have data on this. And they read more
yes,
fiction, they read more memoir, men read history or biography. But
yes.
it's slanted very much towards women, and a lot of the fiction that's read is clearly something that at least touches in part on people's lives. And of course, self-help as a genre that you've alluded to is very popular, and it tends to be dominated by women readers. So are there things you'd like to add, Sian, to what you've said that either we touched on but you want to elaborate more upon, or things that your dumb interlocutor abjectly failed to question you about?
Uh, there's only one thing I wanted to mention, and it relates to another career I've had. The very first proper grown-up job I had when I completed my honours arts degree in politics a million years ago was as a national campaigner for the Australian Conservation Foundation. So my first job was as an environment activist. And this is 1987 to 1990, and I was campaigning on climate change nearly 40 years ago.
Mm.
So, you know, it sort of fills me with horror, really, that in those almost 40 years, we have, as a species, done so little to prevent the kind of approaching horror of climate change, catastrophic climate change. And I do write about that in Childless. It's like another theme of that book, which is when I thought about what are the benefits of being childless in this day and age, well, to be frank, not having children that I have to worry about in the 21st century, worry about the challenges that will face them, is a kind of a blessing in disguise. And of course, I am at the same time profoundly exercised by what's confronting everybody else's children and grandchildren in the future. So I'm also, you know, I'm starting to try and work less in paid gigs at the moment and and trying to re-enter that activist space a bit. So, because part of me has always felt guilty about abandoning that career. I just freaked out, to be honest. 3 years of climate campaigning, and I just was like, I can't live my life focused on this cataclysm. Many of my friends and colleagues have done that, and I'm profoundly admiring of their stamina. But maybe it's time now for me to kind of re-enter the fray and do what I can while I'm still around.
I've noticed in the United States and Britain, the number of people in their 60s, retirees, so significantly older than you, who have dedicated their lives, their bodies, their non-violent direct action commitment to environmental questions, inter alia. It's a real theme. And I think it problematizes some of the conventional cliche notions of what activism is, and especially the unpleasant rhetoric of, tree hugging youngsters who haven't grown up yet, haven't got a mortgage, haven't had a job, yada, yada. So I think there's a really important role there for people in these wonderful expressions, the golden years, which of course are rusting years for many of us, but are allegedly gold. So thank you very much for sharing a lot of your really remarkable life with us and your life writing, as it were, and for taking us back to this question of commitment beyond oneself, that I think runs through your revelatory writings, your self-revelatory writings, but is also something that is empowering this next phase for you. I really, really appreciate it. It was wonderful to have the chance to chat.
My pleasure, Toby. Thanks for the invitation.